Hey good folks, my name is Leif. Welcome to my YouTube channel called Devs and Dice. This show is called Boxes of Shame, where I paint one of my grey miniatures and hopefully breathe some life into it. This week's episode is the second episode of 5, where I paint up all of the young chromatic dragons from Wizkids. If you missed last week's episode where I painted up the young white dragon, then have a look up there. Now this week's dragon is the green dragon, and it's something I've had some personal experience with. The green dragon is considered the most cunning and treacherous of all of the true dragons. They live in the ancient forests of our world, and they're known for terrible aggression, but not so much about territory, more about how to achieve power and wealth in the easiest way possible. Before we start, I want to do a shout out to Army Painter. They sent me a box filled with their equipment and whatnot that basically enabled me to do these 5 videos. So thank you, Army Painter. Now with that out of the way, let's have a look at how I painted up the green dragon from Wizkids.
A couple of years ago I started getting into D&D. As my passion for D&D grew, so did my collection of minis, and like many others out there, I now have boxes of shame. This is me painting every single one of my miniatures.
Alright folks, so this is the young green dragon from Nolser's Marvelous Miniatures. No time to waste, so let's get this puppy out of the box. The miniature looked good from a quick inspection, but what got my attention was the base. I dry fitted everything just to get a feel of how it looks when assembled. The pose looked awesome, but the base did not read as a lush, temperate forest for me. So I started with removing the transparent holder from the decorative base. Then I used some Army Painter superglue to attach the decorative base to the black base. Now these decorative bases can more often than not be slightly warped, so I wanted to apply somewhat even pressure all over. My clamps had developed legs of their own and run away, so I had to improvise. How about this bottle of water? Perfect. Now once the decorative base was glued down, I looked at it again and analyzed what I could do. I wanted large mossy rocks. A while back I bought some pine bark from my local gardening shop. I know these can make awesome rocks. I dry fitted the dragon again just to make sure that I didn't build myself into a corner. Once I felt confident, I started. I used some super glue together with some activator to keep the pace up. Once I had one on, quickly I got a second on, a third, and so on, and finally I had my formation of large rocks in place. Now to work on the variation of scale. I used some Army Painter's basing glue and some of those wonderful battlefield rocks. I used an old hobby brush to spread the glue where I wanted it. Then I sprinkled on some of those rocks. The white glue enables me to move around the rocks where I want them easily using, well, that same old crappy hobby brush. Then I added some brown battleground from Army Painter. This would work nicely as the smallest scale of ground and pebbles. Eventually I ended up with, well, something like this. It looks a little bit too much, but bear with me, it will look great in the end. Once it dried, you could start to see what it would look like. Next step was to prime it, and I went for matte black from Army Painter. Kind of magical once everything is in the same color, right? So I started off with Castle Grey from Army Painter, a grey color with some green undertones. I dry brushed the entire base with this first to start defining the highlights. Once that was done, I used the same brush and started dry brushing in some cultist robe, a dark olive color. I'm coming in quite aggressive, and this is almost an overbrushing more than a dry brushing. Rocks are seldom grey, and we need to have some undertones to make it look awesome. So I come in with some Army Painter's Crusted Sore. Now this color I stipple on, I try to think of it as the veins of different material flowing through the rocks. Then I come in with some Desert Yellow from Army Painter and do the same thing. Just stipple long veins into the rock. Then as the final two colors, I come in with some Arid Earth and Brain Matter Beige to do a final dry brush. I start with Arid Earth and move finally on to Brain Matter Beige. At this point, I would suggest that you go overboard with the highlights. Now this is looking good, but it's gonna get even better. Time to bring everything together with a homemade wash. For this, I'm gonna use some water and a few drops of Army Painter's Airbrush Medium. I pour up a whole bunch of water into a cup. Then I drop in like 3 to 5 drops of the Airbrush Medium. I add some matte black to the cup and just stir it around. Then I come in with some oak brown and mix that into the cup. I constantly tested the solution on the tissue until I was happy with the color. Once done, I cover the entire base with the wash, and as you can see, it behaves very nicely and seeps into all of the nooks and crannies. Now, of course, I had made too much wash, but as luck had it, I had some empty dropper bottles from Army Painter, so I just poured the rest of the wash into the bottle. And wouldn't you believe it, I didn't waste a single drop. Perfect. Now once the wash had dried, it was time to start working on some of that moss. For this, I went with the basing glue and some Battlefield Grass Green from Army Painter. I manipulated the glue where I wanted it using the same old hobby brush. I tried to make it look as chaotic and organic as possible. I had looked at some references to moss and honestly, there didn't seem to be an obvious pattern, so I just sort of went for what I thought looked good. To complete the moss, I simply sprinkled on some flock over the glue. Starting to look really good in my book. Now at this point, I reattached the transparent holder using some super glue. In my bit bin, I found some Reaper familiars and specifically this little lizard dragon thingy. It would be sitting on this rock while his master would take flight behind him. In order to handle this small mini, I had to use my trusty pin vise drill from Army Painter to drill a small hole into the bottom of the familiar. Then I just pinned it using a straightened out paper clip which I attached to a piece of cork. Now onto some grass. I decided to mix a little bit of field grass and steppe grass from Army Painter. I started by laying in some of that Battlefield basing glue where I wanted the grass. Then I used my static grass applicator to try to get the grass where I wanted it. It went okay. I might want to invest in a better applicator in the future, to be honest. Now I wanted some plants here and there, and for that I went with Summer Undergrowth from Army Painter. I placed these under some of the rocks to create some sort of volume and visual interest. Now time for some tufts. I ended up using swamp tufts, woodland tufts, lowland shrubs, and meadow flowers, all from Army Painter. Getting this sort of variation really elevates the base in interest. As a final detail, I added some of my personal dried roots and, of course, the familiar, which I painted off screen in a red color. Time to start focusing on the green dragon. I used my hobby knife to clean off the worst offenders when it came to mold lines. Now my first idea was to utilize the airbrush, and I started with some army green. Once I had a base coat down, I came in with some yellow paint. Which one I don't remember, and honestly it doesn't matter, because I thought it looked terrible. So I started over with some Crypt Wraith, a dark moss green color from Army Painter. I base coated the entire miniature in this and decided that I wanted to use a brush for the rest of the process. Once the base coat was dry, I came in with some military shader from Army Painter. I used a dry brush and covered the entire miniature with this, but I was very mindful of sort of potential pooling. Unlike the white dragon, this miniature had loads of details and I couldn't really access it with an airbrush. Once the wash had dried, I came in with some green skin from Army Painter. I started dry brushing this all over the dragon to achieve a quick highlight. Then I came back in with some snake scales, a brighter green color, and did another dry brush pass. This one I was somewhat more careful with. I used the color Witch Brew from Army Painter to start laying in some bright yellow-greenish highlights on the membrane of the wings. I did this dry brush on both sides of the wings. I wanted some contrast for the underside of a green dragon, so I went with some desert yellow from Army Painter. To ensure that I kept all of the details, I just did 2 or 3 thinned out coats of this. Then I'm coming in with my favorite, skeleton bone, which I dry brush over this, the underside of the dragon. I also glazed in some details here and there just using the same color. Using some strong tone wash, I started defining some shadows where the underside meets the green scales. I'm being very careful here, and I'm also sort of using gravity to work in my favor. Once the wash was dry, I came in with some fire lizard, which I started glazing in on the spine of a dragon. Some phoenix flames to bring out some more yellow color on the wings. Time for that dreaded step. I used some poisonous cloud, a bright green, to start laying in highlights all over the green areas of a dragon. The paint is diluted to ensure that it doesn't go on thick, but just lays on top and punches home those highlights. This pass of highlights really transformed the dragon in my eyes and made the details pop. Dealing with the mouth and tongue, I came in with some vampire red and scar tissue from Army Painter. I start with a base coat of vampire red and then highlight with the scar tissue. Then I mixed in some matte white to create a highlight color for the tongue. Now for the teeth I used desert yellow, which I highlighted with skeleton bone, and then I mixed in some matte white to create a third highlight. Matte black was used on all of the claws of a dragon. Let's have a look at the final results, shall we? Alright folks, 2 dragons down, 3 to go. What did you think about the end result? Good? Bad? Ugly? Please tell me in the comments down below. And as always, if you like what I'm doing here, then please consider liking, sharing, commenting, or subscribing, of course. Now for you faithful that have waited for the highlight of this video, Here comes another Swedish proverb from old times. Jag anar ugglor I mossen. The direct translation is something along the lines of, I suspect owls in the moor or bog. Now in Swedish this simply means I suspect mischief, or I smell a rat about the situation. Alright, with that I want to thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day. Stay safe out there and take care of each other. Until next time.